He had a photo of me in a box in his closet. I was standing outside my building. It was a Tuesday morning. I was carrying coffee. I had never seen this man before in my life. Or that's what I thought, because the date on the back of that photo was 6 weeks before we met. 6 weeks before he walked into that coffee shop, sat down across the room, and pretended to be a stranger. He already knew my name, my address, my schedule, my route to work. He knew everything. And I? I thought I had just gotten lucky. But let me start from the beginning, because to understand what that photo meant, you need to know who I thought he was. Part 1. The coffee shop on Reed Street. I have a routine. I know that sounds boring. I know people romanticize spontaneity and living without a plan, and I used to be that person too. The one who said yes to everything, who drove 4 hours on a Tuesday night just because someone suggested it, who kept her schedule loose because she liked the feeling of not knowing what came next. But life has a way of teaching you that loose schedules have a cost. And after a few years of paying that cost, I built a routine. And I protected it. Every weekday morning at 7:45, I left my apartment on the third floor of a building on Callaway Street and walked 6 blocks to a coffee shop called The Reed. It was small, 11 tables, a counter with 4 stools, a chalkboard menu that never changed. The barista's name was Marco, and he started making my order. Oat milk latte, 1 sugar, extra hot. The moment he saw me push open the door, I would sit at the same table, second from the window, left side. I would open my laptop, answer emails for 45 minutes, drink my coffee, and then walk the remaining 3 blocks to the elementary school where I worked as a third-grade teacher. I had done this, with very few exceptions, for almost 2 years. I tell you this because I need you to understand something before this story goes anywhere. I was not a person who was easy to find by accident. I was a person who was very, very easy to find if you knew exactly where to look. His name was Marcus Hale. He first sat down across the room from me on a Wednesday in March. I noticed him the way you notice anyone new in a small space you've claimed as your own, with a mild, involuntary alertness. He was tall, dark coat. He looked somewhere between 30 and 35. He had a book open on the table in front of him, a physical book, which I remember thinking was slightly unusual for someone who seemed so deliberate in the way he carried himself, like someone who had learned to perform casualness without quite perfecting it. He didn't look at me. I looked at him once, decided he was unremarkable, and went back to my emails. He was there the next Wednesday, and the one after that. By the fourth week, I had filed him away in the category of people I considered regular fixtures of my morning: Marco behind the counter, the older woman who always ordered chamomile tea and read a paperback, the man with the 2 dogs who tied them outside and always gave them a treat when he came back out. And now this person, the one with the book. On the fifth Wednesday, he was at the counter when I walked in, just finishing his order, and he turned at the sound of the door and our eyes met for exactly 1 second. He gave a small, polite nod, the kind you give to someone you've seen enough times to acknowledge, but not enough to speak to. I nodded back. That was all. I sat at my table. He sat at his. I drank my coffee. He read his book. We did not speak. I walked to work feeling completely normal. I had no idea that he had been watching me for 6 weeks before he ever walked into that coffee shop. Part 2. The beginning of what I thought this was. He spoke to me for the first time on a Thursday in April, not a Wednesday, a Thursday. That detail mattered to me later, when I was going back through everything looking for the seams. He had changed the pattern slightly. I think it was intentional. I think he didn't want me to associate him too strongly with the Wednesday routine, didn't want me to realize how consistent his presence had been. A Thursday felt more like a coincidence. I had arrived slightly late that morning, which almost never happened. There had been a problem with my apartment door. The lock was sticking again, and I'd spent an extra 8 minutes wrestling with it before it finally gave. By the time I got to the read, my usual table was taken. A woman with a stroller had parked herself there, baby asleep, coffee cooling, looking like she had not slept in 4 days, and had earned the right to that table more than I ever had. I stood at the counter and looked around. The only available seat was at the small two-person table near the back, next to the one where Marcus always sat. I took it. We sat in silence for about 10 minutes. I was trying to work, but I was flustered from being late, and the emails weren't making sense, and I kept rereading the same sentence. At some point, I made a frustrated sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small exhale that probably communicated more than I intended. "Bad morning?" he said. I looked up. He was looking at me over his book. His expression was calm, curious but not intrusive, the kind of face that doesn't ask too much. "Sticky lock," I said. "It made me late." "Have you tried graphite powder?" he said. "Sorry?" "For the lock, graphite powder. You put a little on the key, work it in a few times. Better than WD-40 because it doesn't attract dust." I stared at him for a moment. That's very specific advice. "I had a sticky lock for 2 years before someone told me that," he said. "I wish I'd known earlier." "I'll try it," I said. "Good." He went back to his book. I went back to my emails. 5 minutes later, I had to leave for work. I closed my laptop, started gathering my things, and he said, without looking up, "It gets easier. The morning, I mean. Bad ones usually do." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just said, "Thanks," and left. I thought about it on the walk to school, not in a significant way, just the way you think about a small, unexpected kindness when you're not used to receiving them from strangers. The next time we spoke was 2 weeks later, also a Thursday. I started to notice that he seemed to arrange things, small, plausibly deniable things, that created opportunities for conversation without ever seeming to pursue them. He would arrive at the counter the same moment I did, so we'd end up ordering side by side. His book would be something I'd read, visible enough for me to see the title, and he'd catch me looking and mention something about it. Once, when I was leaving, he held the door and we ended up walking the same direction for half a block before our paths diverged. None of it was aggressive. None of it was uncomfortable. It was, in fact, so gentle and so gradual that I didn't fully register that it was happening at all. I just knew that over the course of about 6 weeks, this person had gone from a stranger I'd nodded at to someone I looked forward to seeing. His name, I learned it on a Tuesday in May, not a Thursday, which surprised me. He was already there when I arrived. He was writing something by hand in a small notebook, and when I sat down at my usual table, I knocked my bag against the chair, and the sound made him look up. He smiled, not the polite nod, an actual smile. "You're early," he said. "Earlier," I said. "The lock is fixed." "Graphite powder?" "Graphite powder." He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, the kind that goes all the way to the eyes. "I'm Marcus," he said. "Nora," I said. "Nice to officially meet you, Nora." "You too." He went back to his notebook. I opened my laptop, and I sat there with this feeling, quiet and warm and slightly dangerous, that something had just shifted. Part 3. what he told me about himself. We became friends before we became anything else. And I think that was the most calculated part of the whole thing, though I didn't know it then. He told me things about himself in pieces, slowly, across many mornings. He was a contractor, he said. Renovation work, mostly. He worked for a small company run by a guy named Pete, and they took on residential projects around the city. Kitchens, bathrooms, the occasional full gut renovation. He talked about the work with the kind of weariness that felt genuine, long days, physical exhaustion, a current job that was behind schedule because of a supplier issue. He lived in a one-bedroom in the Carver neighborhood, about 20 minutes from where I lived. He drove a truck, an older model, slightly beat up, the kind that had clearly been used for actual work. He dressed plainly, dark jeans, work boots, plain t-shirts under a canvas jacket. He didn't wear jewelry. He didn't have the latest phone. When we eventually started having coffee together instead of near each other, he always offered to pay and never made it feel like a transaction. He was, by every available measure, a regular person living a regular life. I like that. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I liked that he seemed uncomplicated. I had dated complicated before. Men with too much money and too little time. Men whose ambitions consumed them and left everyone else in the margins. Men who treated relationships as something to be managed rather than experienced. I was tired of all of that. Marcus felt like relief. What I didn't know was that everything he told me had been calibrated, not invented exactly. The details about renovation work, those came from a construction company he had invested in 4 years earlier, one of his first acquisitions. He had spent enough time on sites to know the vocabulary, the rhythms, the specific frustrations. The truck was real, but it was one of 8 vehicles he owned. The apartment in Carver existed. He had bought the building 2 years prior and kept one unit specifically for this purpose. I learned all of this later. At the time, I just thought I had met someone real. By June, we were having coffee together 3 or 4 times a week. By July, he had asked if I wanted to get dinner, and I had said yes. We went to a small Italian place near my neighborhood, the kind with paper tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles and a handwritten menu that changed weekly. He let me choose the restaurant. He seemed genuinely happy wherever he was. Our first real date lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything, about the kids I taught. He asked real questions and listened to the answers and laughed in the right places. About his work, the frustrations and the satisfactions, the specific pleasure of seeing a space transform. About our families. His parents were gone, both of them. His father when Marcus was 12 and his mother 6 years ago. He had a younger sister in Portland he talked to every Sunday. He described his childhood as working class and fine, which is the way people describe childhoods that were harder than that, but that they've made peace with. I told him about my sister and my mother and the town in Ohio where I grew up. I told him about how I'd come to the city for graduate school and never left. I told him about the thing I loved most about teaching third grade, which was that it was the year kids started reading for real, not decoding, not sounding out, but actually reading, losing themselves in a story. And you could see it on their faces when it clicked. He listened the way people don't usually listen. Like, what I was saying mattered. Like, he was storing it. I know now that he was, but not in the way I thought. Part 4. The Test. Here's the thing about being tested without knowing it. You can't fail or pass. You can only be. And being yourself, fully and without performance, Feels like the right thing right up until you realize that your entire self has been observed, evaluated, and scored by someone who never told you the game was happening. Marcus tested me constantly for the first 4 months. I understand that now. I can look back and identify almost every single one. The first test was the restaurant, not our first dinner, a different one, maybe the fourth or fifth time we went out. He suggested a place and gave me the name. I looked it up and it seemed fine. Mid range, casual, well reviewed. When we got there, the service was slow. Not unbearably slow, but noticeable. Our server forgot my water twice. The food took 40 minutes. Marcus watched me the entire time to see how I handled it. I handled it fine. I wasn't rude to the server. I didn't make a scene. I made a small joke about it to Marcus and let it go. He visibly relaxed after that. I thought he'd just been hungry. The second test was money. We had been seeing each other for about 6 weeks when his truck needed a repair. Something with the engine, he said. And it was going to be expensive and he'd have to wait until his next paycheck. He mentioned this casually, just sharing, and then said he might need to cancel our plans for the weekend because he was trying to cut back. I didn't offer to pay for everything. I didn't make him feel small about it. I suggested we do something free instead. There was an outdoor concert in the park, no admission, and I had food at home we could bring. He agreed. We had a genuinely good time. Later, I found out that the truck repairer's story was fabricated. He paid cash for everything in his real life. He wanted to see if I'd pity him, patronize him, or quietly start to pull away. I had just made sandwiches and asked if he liked mustard. Test 3 was my school. He came to a fundraiser I'd organized, not because I'd asked him, but because I'd mentioned it, and he showed up, and I was so surprised to see him there that I didn't know what to do. He watched how I interacted with the parents, with my colleagues, with the kids who were running around in the gymnasium in their good clothes, too excited to stay still. He told me afterward that he'd never seen someone so entirely at home in a room. I thought it was a sweet thing to say. Test 4 was a conversation about wealth. We were walking after dinner one night, somewhere around month 3, and he asked me what I thought about money, just casually, like it was small talk. I said what I believed, which was that it was useful, and I didn't have enough of it, but I'd made peace with that, and that I'd seen what the pursuit of it did to people, and I didn't want that for myself. I said I wanted to be comfortable. I said I thought people who defined themselves entirely by what they'd accumulated seemed like they'd missed something important. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if someone had a lot of it? Would that change how you saw them?" I thought about it. It might change my assumptions about them, I said, but not necessarily how I saw them. That would depend on who they were. Fair enough, he said. I thought we were talking hypothetically. We were not. Part 5. When I started to feel it, I fell in love with him sometime in August. I know the exact moment, which is unusual. Normally, love is something you only identify in retrospect, something you were already in before you knew it. But I remember this one. We were in my apartment on a Sunday afternoon. He was fixing my kitchen faucet, which had been dripping for 3 weeks, and which I had been ignoring because I couldn't afford the plumber fee at the time. He'd offered to look at it. Turned out it was just a washer, he said, a 5-minute job. He was under the sink with a flashlight, and I was sitting on the counter above him, reading aloud from a book he'd brought over. A novel I hadn't heard of that he said was the best thing he'd read in years. I was reading. He was fixing the faucet. Rain was coming down outside. My apartment was warm and quiet except for my voice and the occasional metallic clank from under the sink, and I thought, I am completely happy right now. That was when I knew. I didn't tell him for another month. I told him on a night in September when we'd had a small, stupid argument about nothing, the kind that are really about the fear of caring too much, and then had made up in the way you make up when you're both relieved to be past it. We were lying on the couch, and he was running his hand through my hair, and I said it quietly without planning to, the way the truest things usually come out. He didn't say it back right away. He held me tighter. Then, after a long moment, he said, I know. I think I've been there for a while. I didn't ask why he hadn't said it first. I was too happy to ask anything. Part 6. The First Real Crack. October. I had been with Marcus for almost 5 months. We weren't officially living together, but he was at my apartment most nights. We had a rhythm. A real one, not the performed kind. The kind with annoying habits and boring evenings, and the particular comfort of knowing where someone leaves their keys. The crack started small, like they always do. A friend of mine, her name is Dana, we'd been close since grad school, pulled me aside at a birthday party and asked how things were going with the guy I was seeing. I told her. Told her about Marcus, the contractor, the coffee shop, the faucet, the Sunday mornings. She listened with this expression I couldn't quite read and then said, What does he do again? Renovation work, I said. He works for this guy Pete. She nodded slowly. What's his last name? Hale, I said. Marcus Hale. Why? She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she showed it to me. It was a photo from a business magazine, the kind of publication that profiles executives and entrepreneurs and people who have built things. The headline was something about commercial real estate. And in the photo, standing in front of what appeared to be a very large and very expensive building, in a suit that cost more than my monthly salary, was a man I knew extremely well, Marcus. The caption read, Marcus Hale, founder and CEO of Hale Property Group, whose portfolio of commercial and residential assets is estimated to exceed $800 million. I stared at that number for a very long time. $800 million. I looked at Dana. She looked at me. Is that him? She said. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded. I drove home alone that night. I sat in my parked car in front of my building for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I kept picking up my phone to call him and putting it back down. $800 million. I went back through every conversation, every detail he'd given me, the truck, the apartment in Carver, the supplier issue, Pete, the paycheck. I pulled at every thread and watched the whole fabric unravel. He had built a fictional life, handed it to me piece by piece, and watched me fall in love with it. No, that wasn't right. He had built a fictional life and watched me fall in love with him. The person inside the fiction. The man who read physical books and knew about graphite powder and fixed faucets on Sunday afternoons, and listened when I talked about my third graders, like they were the most interesting people on earth. Was that real? Any of it? Or was I just the final test in a sequence I'd never agreed to take? Part 7. The Confrontation. I waited 3 days. I needed 3 days to figure out what I actually wanted to say, because I knew that however this conversation went, it would determine everything that came after it. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I felt. I thought about the Sunday afternoon with the faucet and the rain and the book, and whether that had been real or a performance, and whether I could ever know the difference now. On the third day, I texted him, Can you come over tonight? I need to talk to you about something. He arrived at 7. He had a bottle of wine. He always brought something. and his expression when I opened the door was careful in a way that told me he already knew something was wrong. I didn't take the wine. I stepped back and let him in, and he put the bottle on the counter and stood there and waited. "I know who you are," I said. He was still for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly like something had been released. "Dana showed me the article," I said. $800 million, Marcus. He sat down on the couch. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't try to explain it away. He just sat there, and I stood across the room from him, and the silence was thick and heavy with everything that hadn't been said. "How long?" I said. "Before the coffee shop. How long were you watching me?" He looked up. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it. Right now." And he did. Part 8. What he told me. He had seen me for the first time 8 weeks before he walked into the read. He had been in a meeting at a building his company owned 3 blocks from my school. He had been leaving. He walked sometimes between meetings, trying to keep something ordinary in his days, and I had been coming out of the school with a group of students, walking them to a nearby park for some kind of class activity. He had stopped on the sidewalk to let the group pass. One of the kids had dropped something, a small figurine, some kind of toy, and it had skittered under a parked car. The child was about to crouch down to get it when I stopped her with one hand and got it myself. And then I stood up and dusted it off and handed it back and said something that made the kid laugh. And then I looked up and made brief eye contact with Marcus, who was standing there on the sidewalk watching. And I gave him the automatic polite smile you give to strangers when you've accidentally made eye contact in public. Then I turned back to the kids and kept walking. He said he stood there for a moment after I was gone. He said he didn't know what it was exactly. He said he had seen beautiful women before and had not responded like that. It wasn't entirely about how I looked. It was something in the movement, in the instinctive way I'd protected the child, in the ease of it. He said it sounds irrational, even telling it. He knew that. He had his assistant find out which school I taught at. That wasn't hard. Then he'd had her find out a bit more, where I lived roughly, what my routine was. Enough to engineer a coincidence. She had found the read. He had shown up the following Wednesday. "You planned it," I said. "The whole thing. You picked the coffee shop because you knew I'd be there." "Yes," he said. "And then you made up a life, a fake life, to—" "What? Test me?" He looked at me. "I know how it sounds." "Tell me what it was supposed to sound like," I said, "because from where I'm standing, it sounds like I was an experiment." "It wasn't like that," he said. His voice was strained. "Then what was it like?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have money, a lot of it, and I have been with women who wanted to be near that money more than they wanted to be near me. I have been used. I have been lied to. I have had people perform love for me like it was an audition. And after a while, you start to feel like you can't trust anything. Not a smile, not a conversation, not a single moment that might have been genuine." He looked at his hands. "I saw you and I thought, I just wanted to know if it was real, if any of it was possible, to meet someone who chose me without knowing what I was." "So you decided to lie," I said, "to make sure I was choosing honestly. While you were lying." He flinched. "Yes." "Do you hear how that sounds?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." "You took my choice away from me," I said. "The same thing those women did to you. Taking something from you without your knowledge. You did to me. You just decided it was okay because your reasons were better." He didn't say anything. Were you ever going to tell me? I asked. He looked up. Yes, I was going to tell you. I had a plan. I was going to tell you before the end of the year. I wanted to be sure first. Sure of what? That what you felt was real. What I felt was real, I said. What you showed me wasn't. Part 9, the part that broke me. I should tell you that what came next was the part I was least prepared for. Because up until that point, I had been angry. Clean, clear, justifiable anger. The kind that gives you something to stand on. And I think I had assumed, somewhere under the anger, that the conversation would eventually arrive at an explanation that made it make sense. That there would be something he said that would close the gap between what he'd done and who he was. Instead, he told me about the notebook, the small notebook I had seen him writing in the first morning he spoke to me. I had always assumed it was personal writing, journal entries maybe. I had never asked. He told me that night on my couch that the notebook was where he kept his observations about me. Not in a sinister way, he said. He was trying to say it wasn't sinister. He said it had been notes, things he'd noticed, things I'd said, impressions, things he was trying to understand about who I was. He said he'd stopped writing in it somewhere around month 2 because he'd realized it felt wrong, felt like documentation, felt like the opposite of what he was actually experiencing, which was just wanting to be near me. He said he still had it. I asked him where. He said it was at his real apartment, not the Carver one, the place he actually lived. I want to see it, I said. Nora, I want to see it. He took out his phone and opened a Photos app. He found a photograph of a page and handed me the phone. I read it. His handwriting was careful and small. The entry was from the 3rd week, before we'd even spoken. He'd written down what I was wearing, the exact table I sat at, the time I arrived, the time I left. He'd written down that I tipped Marco well, and that I always held the door for whoever was behind me, and that I looked out the window sometimes with an expression he described as not sad, exactly, more like someone who is thinking about something far away. He had written, "She seems real," and under that, underlined twice, "I need to be sure." I handed the phone back to him. "You have entries from before you spoke to me," I said. "Yes. You were documenting me, like I was a subject. I know how it looks." "I was a subject," I said. "That's what I was to you, a test subject." "You were never just—" "I was," I said. "That's exactly what I was. You didn't know me. You picked me out on a sidewalk and you decided to run an experiment on me. You didn't ask if I wanted to participate. You manufactured every condition. You controlled every variable. And somewhere in the middle of your experiment, you happened to develop real feelings. And now you want credit for that. You want me to see you as the man who fell in love with me. But I can only see the man who watched me." He was silent for a long time. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I know that isn't enough." "It isn't," I said. Part 10, what I found out later. He left that night without resolution. I didn't tell him to go, and I didn't ask him to stay. I just stopped talking, and eventually he stood up and said he'd give me time, and the door closed behind him. And I sat on my couch in my quiet apartment and felt the specific weight of something ending. I didn't sleep. I went over it again and again. Not just the deception, but everything. Every conversation, every moment I thought was spontaneous. Every time he'd seemed to react to something in a way that now I had to wonder about. Was the laugh real? Was the thing he said about his mother real? Was any of the grief and the warmth and the quiet Sundays real? Or had it all been maintenance? the careful cultivation of a subject who was performing satisfactorily. I talked to Dana for 3 hours on the phone. She let me go around in circles. At some point around 2 in the morning, I said something that surprised me. I said, "The worst part is that I still love him." And I meant it. I hated that I meant it, but I did. Because the person I loved, the man with the book and the graphite powder and the Sunday afternoons, that person had been real. Not the biography, not the truck or Pete or the Carver apartment, but the way he listened, the way he asked questions and actually waited for the answer, the way he had appeared at my school fundraiser without being asked, just because I'd mentioned it, the way he'd said, "I know, I think I've been there for a while," and held me tighter. Those things had not been faked. I was almost certain of that. But here's the thing: nobody tells you about being tested without consent. Even if you pass every test, even if the feelings that result are genuine, even if the person who watched you from across a coffee shop eventually became someone who loved you completely and without conditions, you can never unknow that it started with a notebook. I spoke to him again 2 weeks later, not because I decided anything. I hadn't, but because I needed more information and he was the only one who had it. We met at the coffee shop, not the Reed, a different place, one with no history. He was already there when I arrived. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping either. I asked him the question I'd been sitting with for 2 weeks. "If I had failed," I said, "if I'd been rude to the waiter or made you feel small about money or said something that told you I was only there for what you had, what would you have done?" He was quiet for a moment. "I would have walked away," he said. "No explanation," I said. "No conversation. You would have just disappeared." "Yes." "So you were never going to give me a chance to be a whole person," I said. "You were only going to give me a chance to be the version of a person that passed your test." He opened his mouth, closed it. "That's not love," I said. "That's a hiring process." He looked like I had hit him with something. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right," I said. "The question is what to do with that." Part 11. The second thing I didn't know I had thought, going into that second conversation, that what I was dealing with was a man who had deceived me because he was afraid. That was the story I'd constructed, wounded, guarded, went too far, but fundamentally someone who had loved me in a real way and had been too broken to show up honestly. And then he told me about Sophie. I don't know why he told me. Maybe he thought I'd already found out somehow. Maybe he felt like he owed me the full truth, now that part of it was out. Maybe after 2 weeks of not sleeping, he just couldn't hold it anymore. Sophie was a woman he had dated 3 years before me. He had met her in a similar way. Not with surveillance, he said, but with the same general approach, presenting a simpler version of himself, seeing what developed. They had been together for 8 months. He had been, he said, the closest to certain he'd ever been about anyone. He had told her the truth about the money, the company, who he really was. She had stayed. They had been together for another 4 months after that. And then, slowly, he said, things had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single event he could point to, just a gradual reorientation. The vacations she started suggesting, the friends she introduced him to, the way she talked about the future in terms of what they'd have rather than who they'd be. He said he wasn't even sure she was conscious of it. He said he didn't think she was a bad person. He said he thought money just did something to people, something invisible and corrosive, and he'd watched it happen to someone he loved, and it had done something to him that he didn't fully know how to undo. So, you built a test, I said. So, I built a test, he said. And I was the third person you'd run it on, I said. He looked at me. The second. There was someone between Sophie and me. Yes. What happened with her? She failed, he said. Early on, I walked away. I thought about this, and she never knew why. No. So, there's a woman out there who thinks she did something wrong, or that something was wrong with her, and she has no idea she was in a test she never agreed to take. He was quiet. And if I had failed, I said, I would have been the same. I would have just been a woman who thought she'd met someone and then he disappeared, living with that, never knowing. I know, he said, and he looked like he finally fully understood the weight of what he'd done, not just to me, to all of it. Part 12. What I decided. I took a month. I know that sounds familiar. Like every story about a hard relationship decision ends with a month of reflection and a tidy resolution. But I'm not telling you this to be tidy. I'm telling you what actually happened. And what actually happened was that I spent a month being in complete conflict with myself. Part of me wanted to walk away cleanly, to say the foundation of this was wrong. And I won't build on a wrong foundation, and I will mourn what I thought we were and move on. That part of me was clear and certain and felt like self respect. Another part of me thought, but I know him. I know how he takes his coffee and what makes him laugh, and the sound he makes when he's almost asleep, and the way he talks about his sister, and how he looked at me at that school fundraiser like I was the best thing he'd ever seen in a gymnasium. And that part said, isn't this the person? Isn't he exactly what I said I wanted underneath all the wrongness? Someone real, someone present, someone who sees me? And then there was a third part, quieter than the other two, that asked the question I kept trying not to ask. If he is worth loving, and I believed he was, then I was going to have to love someone who had watched me from across a coffee shop for 6 weeks before I knew he existed. I was going to have to love someone who had sat across from me in a diner, smiling, knowing everything, while I sat there knowing nothing. I was going to have to love someone who had built a test and run it on me and decided I passed. Could I live inside that knowledge? Could I hold what was true? That his love was real, alongside what was also true, that I had never fully been free in how I came to it? On the last day of the month, I sat in the Reed, the original coffee shop, Marco behind the counter, my usual table, the window, and I tried to make a decision. And what arrived, instead of a decision, was a feeling, not peace, not resolution, something smaller than that. It was this. I had walked into this without knowing. I could not change that. But I could choose from this moment whether to stay. I had full information now. Every card was on the table. Whatever came next would be entirely mine. That felt like something. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Part 13. What happened? I called him. I told him I wasn't ready to be okay with what he'd done. I told him I wasn't sure I would ever be fully okay with it. I told him that the notebook, the entries from before we'd ever spoken, was something I would have to live with knowing, and that I didn't know yet if I could. I told him that I still loved him, and that I hated that I still loved him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I thought about it. "I need it to be different," I said. "Completely different. No more tests, no more evaluation, no more watching me and deciding if I'm passing or failing. I need you to be entirely honest about everything." Always. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you're afraid of what I might do with the truth. I can do that, he said. I need you to tell me who you actually are, I said. Not the contractor, not Marcus from Carver, the real person, whatever that looks like. That might take a while, he said quietly. I'm not sure I know exactly who that is anymore. Then we figure it out, I said. Honestly, he agreed. We tried. I want you to know that. I want you to know that for 4 months after that conversation, we tried genuinely and hard. He was honest in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable about his fears, about his habits, about the ways the money had isolated him and the ways he'd let it. I met his sister. I saw his real apartment, the one he actually lived in, and stood in it and looked at the life he actually led and tried to understand it. There were good days, real ones, days that felt like what we could have been. But here is what I learned and what I need to tell you, because this is the part of the story that I think is the most important. Trust is not just a feeling, it's a structure. And when you damage the structure, you can repair it. You can work at it, patch it, reinforce it. But the repaired places are never load bearing in the same way. Every time something small went wrong, every time he was a few minutes late and didn't text, every time a conversation felt slightly rehearsed, every time he didn't immediately explain something, I would feel it. A small, cold drop of uncertainty. Not paranoia, not irrationality, just the reasonable consequence of having been deceived. I tried not to let him see it. He saw it anyway. 4 months after we tried again, he came over on a Sunday evening and we sat on the couch, and neither of us said anything for a long time. And then I said, "We're not making it, are we?" He looked at the floor. "I don't know," he said. "I think you do," I said. He was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "Not just for now," he said. "For the beginning. I'm sorry for the beginning." "I know that too." He left. He didn't bring wine this time. He just stood up and I walked him to the door, and he held me for a long moment before he left. Long enough that I memorized it, though I didn't know then that I was memorizing it. And then the door closed. Epilogue. What I know now. It's been 7 months since that Sunday. I still go to the read. Marco still starts making my order when he sees me push through the door. I still sit at the second table from the window on the left side. Some mornings I look at the table where Marcus used to sit and feel something that I don't have a clean word for. Not grief, not anger, not even longing exactly. Something more like the awareness of an absence, the shape of something that was there and isn't anymore. I think about the question of what was real and what wasn't, and I've stopped trying to answer it because I think the question itself is wrong. Things can be real and constructed at the same time. Feelings can be genuine even when the conditions that produce them were engineered. People can love you truly while also doing something unforgivable. That's the uncomfortable thing nobody puts in the stories. The love was real, and it still wasn't enough. And both of those things are completely true. What I've come to believe is this: Marcus was a man who had been hurt in a specific way, and that hurt had taught him that love required proof before it could be given. And I understand that. I can hold that with compassion. But what he'd forgotten, or maybe never learned, was that love isn't something you earn by passing a test. It's something you risk. You give it without a guarantee, without a notebook, without a system. You just give it with your whole heart and hope. He didn't know how to do that, and I couldn't teach him. And that, more than any lie he told me, is what I grieve. I walked past the building where he first saw me the other day. The school, 3 blocks away. I was heading somewhere else. It wasn't part of my route. But I passed it and I stopped for a moment and looked at the front steps where I must have been standing with my students that day, 8 months before I knew he existed. I tried to see it from across the street, the way he must have. I couldn't. I've never been able to see myself the way other people see me. None of us can, really. We move through the world as ourselves, unremarkable, unaware, just trying to get through the day. And sometimes someone is watching from a distance, deciding that we are worth knowing. And sometimes their way of knowing us is gentle and honest and leaves us better than it found us. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the person who watches you from across the street loves you more carefully and more wrongly than anyone has ever loved you before. And sometimes that is the same person. And you don't know until much later which part you'll miss more. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying. Leave a comment telling me what you would have done. Because honestly, I'm still not sure I made the right choice.